What happens when a malicious web app slips through your defenses? There's no malware, there's no user account compromise, it's just a simple granting of permission consent. Well, today I'm going to be joined by Keith Fleming, a PM with Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, and we're going to break down the landscape of app-to-app security and what your IT team needs to watch out for. So let's get into it. So when we talk about OAuth security, SaaS security, app-to-app security, these are kind of new terms. What specifically do we mean when we talk about that kind of stuff?
Yes, app to app, or what we call non-human identities, we really think about those as interactions that are happening from an application or a service principal directly to some kind of an API endpoint. So that could be, a service principal that exists in Azure and it's making a call to Graph to retrieve email information. Today with Graph, there's a whole variety of different things that you can do. There are, endpoints for mail, there are endpoints for interacting with Entra and configuring settings or pulling configuration settings. So it could really be quite broad. But in a nutshell, it's really a non-human identity that's interacting with an API endpoint that's associated to a SaaS application.
Right, cool. And so that concept of the non-human identity, it's kind of scattered all over Entra, right? To your point, you mentioned service principals, and you've got these, I guess that's kind of also called the enterprise application within Entra. It gives out permissions. What are the what are the kind of the big risks that customers might face then with that? Because, hey, I've just given this app permission that it needs because, hey, I I just want this app to run, and the developers told me to give away these bunch of permissions. So what are the concerns, I guess, that come out of that?
Well, there are really two different scenarios that we're most concerned about today. The first is of course, end user consent to an application. A very real scenario that we see happening today is a user will get a link to an application, and it's malicious, right? So it's an OAuth consent phishing. It looks valid. Hey, maybe it's a link to open up some kind of bonus information, or some kind of spreadsheet that looks interesting, and then they click it, and they're presented with a consent dialog, and they click. They've seen this consent hundreds of times across possibly Facebook or Entra, and then they click allow, right? And from that point, the app has permissions to do whatever is granted. So it could be read a mailbox, it could be write to the mailbox, and it could be create rules, delete mail, and things that you can do to exfiltrate data that way. That's one scenario. The other scenario that we see is what you also described too. When we think about least privilege and zero trust, we're all builders and developers and trying to run operations. Like, let's say a developer is building a line of business application and they need a particular permission for Graph, and a really common thing is like to over permission an application. So like, let's say you give it more permissions than it needs to be able to do what it's doing, right? And in that scenario, those applications can be dormant in the environment, and then as soon as if there's a credential or some kind of a client secret that gets compromised, then an adversary has the ability to leverage that application. So there are really two different types of scenarios that we're most concerned about: either direct user consent or admin consent over apps that are developed by organizations.
Gotcha. And so I guess that kind of plays into, in my head, I kind of think of two types of threat. You have the OAuth app that is deliberately malicious, right? So, hey, I'm an adversary. I've got an Entra tenant and I provisioned an application purely for the purpose of exfiltration of data. But
Mhm.
then to your point, well, there may be applications out there that they're safe for now, and we've attested that they're okay. But what about the future, right? What if there's a supply chain compromise or a secret leak, something like that? And so, Defender for Cloud Apps, it's kind of covering both those scenarios. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have, of course, we're natively integrated with XDR. So, we're able to work with Defender for Office and the other workloads to, disrupt some of those OAuth attacks that are happening when OAuth consent phishing happens. So that's one scenario that we do cover. But we also have capabilities to help with your posture of these non-human identities, or app to apps that are apps that are in provisioned in Entra with permission. So we can show you that hey, this app is overprivileged. It hasn't or it hasn't been used for this amount of time, or it has this permission that hasn't been used for X amount of time, and then you can take action on those. So yeah, we provide coverage for both of those scenarios, just in slightly different formats.
Gotcha. And I know in Defender for Cloud Apps, there's this concept of connected apps, right? But there's also well, in Entra, I've got all these OAuth apps there anyway, right? What's these are just different ways that Defender for Cloud Apps, to me, can kind of touch apps and understand what's going on about them. What's the difference between those two things, right? I've got my connected apps, I've got my apps that I can cover with app governance. Can you maybe just kind of demystify that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are really two different things, as you mentioned. App governance is that's the functionality that we use to pull in different apps from Entra, or other third party connected applications as well too. So that gives you visibility into the apps that are there, what the permissions are, how often they're being used. That's part of it, right? But then from a threat detection and incident response perspective, you also need to know what is this app actually doing. So that's where the connected application comes into play. So we have about 30 different app connectors in Defender for Cloud Apps, and one of those, of course, is in Microsoft 365. So when you connect Microsoft 365, you're able to see the audit data that's generated. So what we'll do from Defender for Cloud Apps is we'll ingest essentially the Purview audit logs or unified audit logs. We'll add enrichments to those. So we'll also tell you what is the what's the IP, or what's the geolocation for this IP address? Is it a risky IP? So we add enrichment on top of that, and then correlate all those signals together. So you have app governance, which surfaces the data about the application, and then you have the corresponding signals that show what the app is doing. For instance, if you want to go see, what mail items this particular app is accessing, because we're part of XDR, you can see that and then join that across tables that exist in XDR for email as well. So it's really a combination of both things. One is for discovery, and then the other is really more skewed towards threat detection, but you need those signals to perform incident response on those.
Right. That's really cool, because one of the things you just kind of mentioned there was that, at least from a app governance perspective, it's not only going to be my OAuth apps as they exist in Entra. You also mentioned things like Google Workspace, and I think Salesforce might be in there as well, right? So if I'm in an environment and I have these other, I guess they're almost like their own little kind of identity provider, right? And they've got their own app to app relationships, that really extends coverage way beyond just Microsoft first party and Entra. So if I've got Google Workspace, I'm also going to benefit from this type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we pull in data from M365, but we also have this for third parties too. Today we do support Google, and also Salesforce too. If there are permissions that are granted to allow access to Google Mail, or Google Apps or Google Workspace, something in that area, we'll surface those applications as well too. So yeah, it's broad. It's not only M365. We do cover third party apps as well.
Right, that's cool. And one of the reasons I think it's so cool is when you kind of think of XDR, sure, it's kind of broad insofar as it's pulling signal from a whole bunch of sources, but you kind of think of XDR as being very focused on Defender for Endpoint and Defender for Identity, Defender for Office 365. But what we're also saying is we can go into third party and pull that data out, right? Something that maybe conventionally you think, well, I need a SIEM for that, right? But just by the virtue of having that E5 license, I can get vast array of coverage is the kind of one of the messages I'm
Yeah,
taking there.
yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the really cool things about Defender for Cloud Apps is we can bring these signals in and enrich them. So, like I said, we add the enrichment, but then we also add the correlation. So if you have a user that exists in M365, you've got a user that exists in Salesforce, and you've got a user that exists in Google, if that's the case, And we're able to correlate that so you can see all of that user activity in the same schema in a single location within the Cloud App Events table or within the activity log in XDR. Because it's natively integrated with XDR, you can hunt across all of those all of those activities. Join across other endpoint data or MDO data, whatever it may be. And then, if you do want to consume that in a SIEM, you can either stream that through the API, or there's a couple of checkboxes to turn it on in Sentinel to get the data. So we can kind of take all that information and standardize it into a common schema, so that way you can distribute it to your SIEM. So that way you don't have to normalize it yourself. So I think that's a really strong point that we offer today that maybe people aren't super aware of. So that's yeah, great to. I think it's great. I'm a data geek myself, so I'm a big fan of common schema when I'm hunting for stuff.
It's a good point. It's a good point. One of the things you mentioned that I think really goes under the radar is even if I've got, I guess, out the box with tenants provision now, I've got that unified audit log, right, just by the virtue of it existing in 365. But there's still advantage of that integration with Defender for Cloud Apps because of that enrichment, because of that normalization across all the different SaaS apps.
Exactly. Yeah, because I mean, really, it's great to have it in the unified audit logs. I think there's certainly uses for that, but bringing those signals into XDR is so important, right? Because not only do you get the common schema, but there are some more advanced scenarios in XDR, such as attack disruption, that are also supported by those SaaS signals. And we see today that we talk about some of these issues that were some of the challenges that organizations run into. And applications are, SaaS apps themselves are attack vectors. There are attacks happening that are purely happening in the cloud that aren't happening on endpoints. They're not going to be covered by XDR, so you need to have those SaaS signals. It's really becoming a critical part. It's really becoming a critical part of your protection. And if you're using M365 and you have the license for it, it's not going to cost you anything to turn it on. Just go in and enable it, and then you get the benefit of having those signals available in XDR and some of the more advanced capabilities that it provides.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great point because app governance, historically, in its kind of embryonic stages, it was that add-on license, but hey, you now get it as part of
Mm-hmm.
that E5 stack, which is really cool. And to your point about these attacks that exist only within the cloud, I think that's really something that, what would you say? It's really it's a change in the conventional thinking about security, right? If I think back to my origins when I'm a sysadmin starting, starting too long ago, back in my original sysadmin days and being help desk and all that kind of stuff, I
Mm-hmm.
had endpoint security and I had email security, but I guess those will help me enrich some of the data here, but you need that app, that Defender for Cloud Apps, that's really going to focus on the SaaS play as well, because that's where the modern data is, right? That's what the adversaries want. They want that data, they want that money that they can compromise out of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, if you think about it, identity is the perimeter, particularly when it comes to SaaS, right? Because if I'm an adversary and I've got a credential, let's say that I've got an application and I've got a credential, either I've got consent to an application and I can, make an API call. There's no endpoint involved in that. I'm purely connecting to an endpoint in the cloud, doing whatever I need to do, exfiltrating whatever data that I need to have, and I'm not touching an endpoint. You're never going to see that happening. So, endpoints are critical. They still are critical today. There are a lot of threats that exist on the endpoint, but there are absolutely we see this from nation states. We see this from organized crime threat actors. This is certainly a vector that they're leveraging today, and they don't need an endpoint to do it. They just need they need a credential. They log in. Attackers don't break in; they log in, and that's particularly true when it comes to app non-human identities for sure.
Yep, 100%. I mean, you mentioned client secrets leaking and all that kind of stuff, right? GitHub is a hidden of place of stuff like that, right? And
Hmm.
so that kind of gets me thinking. We've so far we've really spoken about a lot of the kind of the telemetry that Defender for Cloud Apps and App Governance can bring in to show me, hey, well, what are the permissions this app is actually using, so I can potentially revoke those permissions and go least privilege. I'm also aware that app governance can actually, well, it can do remediation, right? So, for example, it's got policies where say, hey, if we identify a type of risk, let's go away and do stuff like disable the app. Could you maybe put a little bit more high definition on that? Like, so what are the specific types of threats that these policies could protect against?
Yeah, absolutely. There are really three different things that come to mind today, right? So you've got, you have your standard, you have your standard policies where, an organization is concerned about, this particular kind of application. Maybe they're concerned about, applications that are, high risk, or they have high privilege, or they've got specific permissions. Maybe they want to look for, for instance, they want to create a policy that looks for directory read write all permissions that that are assigned to unpublished applications. Um, that's one scenario, and you can absolutely create policies to do that today. There are, I don't know how many different conditions. There's probably like 20 different conditions that you can use to create a policy to alert on that. And if you want to, you can take action. So you can either generate an alert which flows into XDR, go remediate it manually, or you can have Defender for Cloud Apps go in and disable the application automatically when that happens, so you can go make sure that it's not malicious and then go turn it back on. So that's one scenario. The second scenario are the built-in threat detection alerts that we have today. So the way that we work is that we have a team of security researchers. All they're doing is looking for threats. They're looking for things that are happening today, out in the wild, what these threat actors are doing, and then they're authoring these alerts, and those will just happen out of the box. So just by turning on app governance and connecting the M365 and Azure, you'll get those detections, and they'll just happen. So those will be surfaced in XDR automatically. So for instance, if we see that, hey, you have this application, it's existed in your environment for a long time. Hey, it's starting to make a whole bunch of EWS calls to this legacy exchange endpoint, all of a sudden. That's, some kind of an anomalous incident. Or, hey, this application is, we're seeing it modify a whole bunch of inbox rules. This looks suspicious to us. We have detections for those out of the box that are based on anomaly and machine learning and AI. Um, the third way that we do that is through automated attack disruption. So, and this is personally one of my favorite features, because that's really one of the true values of Microsoft XDR. Once you get all these signals in, you get your SaaS signals in, you get your signals from Defender for Office, Defender for Identity, Defender for Endpoint. You get all those in, and if we see an application that is malicious, and we are, above 99% sure that it's malicious, we can actually shut it down before it even happens. So there are really a lot of different ways that we provide, capabilities that help protect organizations today.
I love the attack disruption. I can't remember who I heard refer to as this, but in my head, I kind of think of it as like just hitting that pause button on the attack,
Hmm.
right? Insofar as I know that when I tell folks, hey, this will disable the app, they think, oh, that sounds bad. And I guess it's not ideal, but again, it's very easy to re-enable the app, right? You're just kind of, it's just a very temporary kind of block that you can enable and disable. But I guess one thing that's one of the common questions I then get is, well, how prone is this going to be to false positives and things like that, right? Now, what kind of work goes on in the background based on the security researchers you just mentioned, based on the product team, to um, strike that balance, right, between being too noisy, between too aggressive, and making sure that you get as reliable a detection as possible, because it can't be easy, right?
Yeah. Well, I think historically, SOC teams have always, alert fatigue is a real thing, right? So if you look historically at how SOCs operate, there's an alert from a system. You go triage it, you look at it, it's false positive, it's not, it's false positive, it's true positive, whatever. Um, the real value of XDR is it can take all those signals. So like when you look at something that's happening from attack disruption, it's not just that we see something happening from Defender for Cloud Apps, right? We see the entry point and we see, hey, Entra shows that, this is an anomalous IP. We haven't seen activity from this IP before. And then we see, hey, there was a phishing link that was clicked, because this is coming from Office, right? And then you see in that same chain of events, hey, now there's a suspicious inbox manipulation. So when all of those on their own may not have enough fidelity, but when you start to put them together for a single user, it really creates a very high fidelity incident where we are, like I said, above 99% sure that it is a false positive, or that it's not a false positive, that it is a true positive, and it is in fact a malicious application that's trying to exfiltrate data. So there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that those are only the highest SNR. They have to have the highest confidence possible, but we need to see that correlation of signals across multiple different workloads, so that way we can be sure that, hey, this is in fact an attack. So there's a lot behind that.
Sure. That, I mean, it's very validating to hear that, right?
Mhm.
That there is such a reliability that goes into the back of this, that kind of over 99% figure. And I guess like also what's possible. Fact check me on this one, please. But I don't. If I'm interested in these policies that may automatically disable the app if it starts triggering on the types of threat I'm interested in, this doesn't have to be tenant wide, right? You can scope it potentially for applications that I'm specifically interested in.
Yeah, so for attack disruption, it's just on. So if the signals are there, then we'll do it. And like I said, it's only the highest SNR that are available. It'll happen at the tenant level. For the individual policy, so if like you want to create a custom policy and then you want to disable an application, you can scope that to specific apps. So if you want to exclude apps that that are valid in your environment, you can absolutely do that. So there are some ways to scope it down and reduce reduce the impact on apps that are okay in your environment if that's important to you.
That clarifies it perfectly. And I guess one other point that might be worth clarifying is app governance historically focused around, and I think exclusively around things that were available via the Graph API, right? And that was the kind of stuff that we could query and detect. My understanding is that's kind of expanded uh, in recent months to kind of support more APIs. Is that accurate to say? And what does the current landscape of app governance's scope currently look like in terms of things it can query?
Yeah, absolutely. For M365, yes, you're absolutely right. We used to only surface permissions that were in Graph, and while that is the majority, there are still a lot of legacy APIs that are used today. You look at the legacy EWS API, for instance. That's very common. A lot of organizations still use it. There's the old Active Directory or Entra API, I should say, that customers still could potentially be using. So we heard feedback from customers, hey, we need more coverage. So we added all first party APIs. So even if it's a graph or non-graph permission, you'll be able to see it in Defender for Cloud Apps today in the app governance within the app governance information that we surface.
That's really, really cool. And it kind of it makes me think about that kind of holistic protection. And when I think of that, I think of the end-to-end picture of security. And thus far, when we've been talking about app-to-app security, we've kind of been talking about the identification of anomalous behavior, responding to bad stuff as it happens or after it's happened. But also, we now have Microsoft Security Exposure Management, right? And it pulls in signals across Defender XDR in terms of the integration with Defender for Cloud Apps, ki- so that I can focus on security before a breach and that kind of posture management play. What does that integration look like?
Yeah, so one thing that we heard from customers, particularly very large customers, is, hey, we need a better way to prioritize the apps that we want to go tackle first. And that's one of the really great things that I love about exposure management is it gives it kind of breaks things down into threats and domains, and it gives you some priority to go look for those instead of just having thousands of a page of thousands of recommendations, right? So that, which isn't very actionable. So that's one thing. But one of the cool things that's being introduced now with through exposure management is the idea of the attack graph, right? So you'll be able to see what a user has. There's an attack path through a service principal, there's a delegation, and then it grants access to this resource, right? So and then you can see the choke points for that, so you're able to go track down, hey, which ones are which ones are my biggest choke points where I have the highest risk that I need to go remediate right now. So yeah, there's some really cool stuff in this space. And the attack graph is really cool because I think it's when you think about shifting left, one of the key things for, like I said, we used to have this huge list of recommendations. You need to know where to focus. And I think exposure management is a great tool to help zero in on like where you need to go look first to really make a measurable difference in your posture and make sure that you are actually secure. Because we know it's there are typically going to be gaps. Customers are not going to be able to address every single risk that exists, but if you can help close the door to some of those largest risks, then that really does shift your posture in the long term.
Great point, and amen, because I spend a lot of time presenting to customers, here's the result of a security assessment of your environment. And by the way, I checked 300 things. And as soon as you get a list of 300 things, whether it's surfaced via some security assessment I do, whether it's just that kind of general security recommendations you might get in Secure Score, customers crave that prioritization, right? And
Hmm.
it's saying, well, my resources are finite. I've only got so much time and money that I can spend on it. And so I guess with the the integration with Defender for Cloud apps, that SaaS security, something that when we kicked off the show, we mentioned maybe not as front and center to people's opinions and people's thoughts as it should be. Exposure management is going to help kind of surface that data, say, well, actually, here's the real risk that might be present in your environment.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah, I think you're spot on. We hear from customers all the time, hey, I don't have the resources to tackle all of this. That's the reality that we live in today. And I think that's one of the things that exposure management does really, really well is it helps you understand. But um, yeah, between attack paths and particularly we have a SaaS security initiative. So we talked about app connectors earlier. Once you connect those app connectors, if we support posture management, then we'll surface those as well too. But then we also have recommendations for those apps too that we're surfacing there. So yeah, it's with the priority is a huge thing, and we acknowledge that we need to do a better job for customers to give priority to what do you need to go do.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the SaaS security initiative because that's kind of really, to me, I mean, you know what this industry is like. There's so many acronyms and abbreviations, but one of the ones that you can kind of apply to Defend for Cloud apps is SSPM, right? SaaS Security Posture Management. And for folks that aren't aware, one of the real cool things that Defend for Cloud apps can do is it can add these third-party SaaS apps. Think of things like DocuSign, Salesforce, and so on. It can add them to Secure Score. And I guess this initiative that you mentioned over in exposure management, it's really the evolution of that, right? That kind of that ability to get the data and manage it in a way that is a little bit more, what would you say? I guess customizable, and you can set your own threshold and things compared to Secure Score. Is
Mhm.
that an accurate representation?
Yeah, yeah, it is, and I think the cool thing about it is those app connectors are really dual purpose. They provide the posture recommendations. If they're available for an app connector, they're all surfaced in exposure management through the SaaS security initiative or recommendations. They're prioritized, you know what to tackle. But then they also do threat protection as well. So if you connect those applications, you're really getting two uses out of them at once. So you do one job, you're going to get the benefit of two different things, which I think is a really powerful capability.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, totally agree because I love it when I connect these apps and it tells me, here's how you can go in to prove all these other apps, and you might have no idea where to start, right? But as soon as you get those kind of apps connected and it starts making the API calls and all that good stuff, it'll say, hey, you should go away and change this, that, and the other setting over in Salesforce to make it more robust and secure. And that breadth of coverage, that idea that we can help struggling IT admins and security engineers, geez, pull that marketing term out the bag, shift left. That's
Hmm.
just so, so cool. And
Yep.
to me, that's one of the big kind of call to actions I always have to folks is just start, connect the apps, right? I guess there's very low risk at doing that, right? There's pretty much no reason you wouldn't go away and do that. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, when you're connecting these applications, we're really just we're reading them. So we're ingesting the information. So you get it in SaaS posture management, but then you also get it in threat detection as well. And you're spot on. Security admins today are stretched very thin. They have a lot of responsibilities. They're trying to cover a lot of different areas, and we want to help those people, so that way they know what to do, because we know they struggle. They struggle with the amount of work that they have today, and they don't have time to go be a Salesforce expert. They don't have time to be a ServiceNow expert, because those are different disciplines. So yeah, the whole purpose here is to try to provide insights to the people that need them, so that way they can improve posture, without needing to be very super deep in an area, and that way they can go take it to their application teams to help remediate those threats.
Love it. And listen, as we kind of approach the wrap up of the show, is there anything like what would be your main kind of call to action for viewers and listeners? I guess number one in terms of what's the key thing that folks need to go away and do if they haven't been doing it already, right? Like what's your main top of mind for security?
Hmm.
But then also, um, if I don't have Defender for Cloud Apps, let's say I'm currently going through that process of, justifying the E5 license or something internally. What's your what's your biggest kind of shout out to the value proposition of MDA?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we talked about this earlier. The SaaS is an area that is, it's continuing to grow. It's not getting smaller, and there are increasing number of threat actors that are leveraging SaaS as the attack mechanism, right? There are no endpoints involved. It's purely cloud-based attacks. So it's really critical to secure those assets. That's the first thing I would say. There are a lot of high profile attacks that have happened where they are cloud only, and data's been exfiltrated, emails have been exfiltrated, and organizations have been damaged because of it. So that's the first thing. And then if you do own licensing today, you can go into XDR to settings and turn on app governance with one click. You can then go in and connect the M365 connector with one click. You can connect Azure with one click, and then you start to ingest all of those signals. So you're starting to get visibility into those non-human identities that exist today, and then you also get the threat protection capabilities as well. And one thing that I always talk to customers about, like non-human identities, I don't know that they're really well known, but when I try to relate it to something that's been around for a long time, think about Active Directory. Um, if you're an administrator for Active Directory and you have a service account, in your domain, and it's got domain admin permissions and it's stale, that there's a huge risk for that, and you're gonna disable it. You're going to turn it off. You're going to remove their permissions. You're going to convert it to, you're we assume that people are going to try to apply zero trust principles of least privilege to that. You need to do the same thing for your non-human identities as well, because when you look at an application that maybe it's a good application, maybe it was developed by your organization, could have been a good application, maybe somebody steals a secret, and if it's got directory read write all or other very high privilege permissions, then you essentially have someone in your tenant or that has API access to everything you can do with Entra Global Admin. So you need to begin to treat non-human identities in a similar fashion that you do to service accounts in Active Directory, because they are really the same thing. That's just the way the nature of everything is shifting. So I would say, yeah, non-human identities are critical, and you need to look at how to secure those, reduce your reduce your privileges, connect the applications, get all the signals, and then start to look at those more deeply.
Advice, great advice, and a great note to end the show on. Keith, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Rue. I appreciate it.